I'm delighted to welcome Glenn Parker to the show today. As a consultant for more than 40 years, Glenn has helped create high-performing teams at hundreds of organisations, including Novartis Pharmaceuticals, Merck and Company, Bristol Myers Squibb, Philips Van Hoosen, and many, many others. He's currently a consultant to Accenture, where he developed numerous online courses in professional and leadership development, including the recent webinar, Positive Influence, Finding People Who Can Help You Be Your Better Self. He is internationally recognised workshop facilitator, organisational consultant, and conference speaker in the areas of teamwork, collaboration, and team meetings. He is an author or co-author of over 16 books, that I could go on. We'll be here all night. We won't get a chance to talk to Glenn with the great bio he's got. And his recent book this year that has come out called Positive Influence, Leadership in a Time of Crisis. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great, yeah, me too. Just tell us a little bit about you, a little bit more background about you. Where people will guess that you are from the States somewhere, but it's a big place. So tell me about where you're from, family, friends.
It's a big place, and I grew up in one of the biggest, maybe the biggest place, New York City. Basically, a child of a hardworking, working-class parents. Pretty much grew up on my own on the streets. Figuring things out because my parents were working, 6-7 days a week and some nights. And so I played a lot of sports, played a lot of street games that we kind of invented, because of lack of resources and facilities. And went to local high school and local university in the city as well. Pretty much spent a good chunk of my life, on the underground, on the subway, going back and forth all over the place. And so I went from there to graduate school, to university, to advanced degrees and the like, and went out into the workplace and spent a good part of time working for a number of different organizations, and eventually went out on my own as a consultant. And I always wanted to, I always wrote, and I always wanted to be an author. And I kind of was nibbling around the edges, writing articles, and trying, I guess all along what I was doing was trying to get my courage up to write a book, because I revered people in our field, the great gurus of management and leadership and organizations. And I thought, my gosh, can I ever achieve that? So it took me a long while to get there, and I had some help along the way. Someone who was a positive influence on me and encouraged me to take a leap and write a book, because he felt I had it within me, because I had talked to him about what I wanted to write about. And that was life-changing, Nigel. It really changed the trajectory of my life and my career. I wrote this book called Team Players and Teamwork, and I was fortunate to get a very good editor, and they, Josie Bass, which has now been folded into John Wiley Publishers, published the book. It's called Team Players and Teamwork, and it became very successful. And suddenly, I was just an average guy, and then the next day I was a world-acclaimed author. But so, fortunately, I knew the difference, and other people may not have noticed it. But it was the first book that really talked about what it means to be a team player. And we defined that in fairly specific terms. Also developed a self-assessment instrument that people would fill out and could get a reading on what type of team player they were. And it resonated with a lot of people, to the point, and that got published separately in a separate booklet, and people used it in their own self-developed team building with organization. And I, of course, used it many times, and it's I don't even keep count anymore, but the last count which was some years ago, and it sold over 2 million copies. This little
Wow.
18-page booklet, and it's still available, and people are still using it. So I went from there, and then suddenly I really got empowered and started writing more and researching more and talking more about teams and different kinds of teams, and went on from there. And of course, I also had a family. I'm married. I have children. I have grandchildren, and so a big part of my life. I got hit on the side of the head a number of years ago when suddenly, out of the blue, and I was diagnosed with cancer, and
Oh, wow.
ended up with, and this isn't going back now, I don't know, to 20, 25 years. So, I'm still here. I'm happy
Yeah.
about that. Um, but that was
Good.
also, and Nigel, I was a runner. I ate correctly and properly because, as you know, from being on the road, you have to take care of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not easy to do, and I did. I hardly ever went to the doctor. I took no medications at that time, so it was a stunning thing. But I turned that into something positive because once I started to feel better after I was treated for it, I volunteered with the American Cancer Society and developed. I wanted to get the word out to other men because I felt I was ignorant about this
Yeah.
disease and how to control it and how to maybe prevent it or at least get early diagnosis, which, as you know, is the key to successful treatment. So I started something called Run for Dad, which is an event that uh, emphasized the importance of early detection and good health. And so it's been very successful in the last 18 or 20 years. It's a run and a walk, and people raise money for cancer research. So that's maybe a lot more than you needed, but it's also it's more about me because not only I have this personal side, and I also am a community activist. I work to try to make things better outside of my work life. So there you have it.
No, brilliant. That's interesting. There's so many things to unpick out of that. I think it's interesting about the authoring and like you, I've done a couple of books. I've done self-publishing. It's available now to actually do that, and there's less gatekeepers in many ways, and that's both positive and good. But I think that the thing is that something I heard not long ago was that, and a few authors that I've had on, and first-time authors I've had on the show, and I think the thing is that certainly with tools, techniques, and ideas, no one's ever had your experience. No one's got your ideas, and no one's got your voice, have they, on what you're writing? And it's kind of, if you're writing, I think with something, if you're writing a book to make a lot of money, you're writing it for the wrong reason. If you're writing a book to help people, or you're writing a book to tell a story that you want to tell, that's the right reasons to do it. And then it's kind of, it doesn't matter if you wrote your original book and it helped 10 people. I imagine whilst you'd be sitting there thinking, I'd like it to sell, if you help 10 people, that's still help. That's part of that thing that's inside you, isn't it? Is to be able to say, right,
Right.
that's helped one person, that's helped
Yeah.
2 people. And if it's helped 2 million people and more, because I'm guessing they've used it more widely with other people, and then that must feel really good.
Yeah, and it's um, it's significant because I'm always writing about what I'm doing. So when I'm out working with clients, working with teams, um, I'm I'm doing things and then I'm reflecting on them, and most often they end up in some writing aspect, some publication aspect, where because what I write for practitioners, I'm not writing for academics. I'm writing for practitioners. people who are going out, they're in the trenches, they're doing the job, doing often the same job I'm doing, and they're looking for help.
Yeah.
And that's people contact me all the time about, well, what about this? Can I do this with your book or with your survey? And I'm happy to have that because I that's who that's my audience. My audience is the folks in the field who
Yeah.
are, struggling to figure it out and want help. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And as I say, it's that helping of people is the reason. If you the number of times you if it's done from a cynical reason just to create something
Right.
to help people, that's got to be the
And,
priority.
and I
Isn't it?
also think, Nigel, that very often people come to me because of the books, and say, how do I write a book? And I
Yeah.
say, let's sit down and talk because I know I couldn't have made it without help, without someone who was a positive influence. And that's what I try to be also. Say yes to anybody and everybody, um, and about how to get started, all this kind of stuff. How do you
Yeah.
write a book? It's you don't just sit down and say, I was born, and, um, anyway. So you got to think like, who's the audience? Who are you writing for?
Yeah.
That's one of the key things that people often forget is that there's an audience, and who's your target audience? Just like you would for a consulting job. Who's the target audience for it? And it all comes back very often what the goals, and that's what's critical. So
Yeah, I think I listened to Seth Godin's podcast, and he talks about that thing of knowing sometimes some marketing perspective, and it's the same for targeting a book. Really, some people go, well, who would you like to buy your book, or who would you like to buy your service? And someone will go, well, everybody. And it's kind of,
yeah,
well, that's if you're creating something for everybody, you're potentially creating nothing for any of them, because there's a niche, isn't there? And by identifying that avatar, that person that you're talking about
right,
there, who you've got in your mind, who is in the trenches, that creates, I think it's really useful, because sometimes with even taking those things of thinking about how are you going to, you've got team members, and how are you going to manage team members, how are you going to work as a team player, and having that understanding of who those people are and what, or who the person you want to be to help them is probably quite a good way of looking at it. But I think it's, if you try and be all things to everyone, you haven't got a chance. There are people who are
yeah,
going to love you, there are people who are going to hate you, and there's going to be a lot of people in the middle who kind of need swaying, and that's
yeah.
where it is.
So you want to go in depth, rather than cover the waterfront.
Yeah,
You want to figure who that audience is and what you can do with that particular audience. And that audience can be pretty wide. If you say,
yeah.
it's focused on human resource directors. That's still a pretty
It's a few
large group
million.
of people. Yeah. So, but it's not IT directors. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not marketing people. So there are certain groups of people that it's not. So it does have a niche, and that's what you're looking for. And I try to put myself in the head of those people who are out there and trying to figure it out.
Oh, that's brilliant. So it's probably worth talking about positive influence. I think you mentioned that there's like a series of books that you've done, and your latest one is the positive influence in a time of crisis. Do you want to
Yeah.
just define what is positive influence?
Well,
How would you
let
describe
me,
it?
you know, and we've talked about this. A big part of how I we try to communicate is through stories and through quotes, through that we've collected through these interviews. We try to humanize it. We try to make it inspiring because someone else has been there and talked about it. So let me tell you one of my stories that this happened to me. This was my first real job out of graduate school, my first boss, and we've come to the time of my first performance appraisal. So my first boss name is Larry, and Larry and I are sitting down, and he's reviewing my performance over the last almost a year that I've worked there, and it's going well. You know, he thinks I've done a good job. And I have to tell you that now on reflection, it was pretty boring work because I would look up, he'd give me a topic, I'd look up things, I'd write a report, and I'd hand it off to some people who were supposedly going to use it, and then I'd get another, I'd research it, and I'd write another report. It was pretty boring. So we get to that point in the performance appraisal toward the end where it's your career goals, your development plan. And he said, "Well, Glenn, you know, what do you want to do going forward?" And I had thought about this because I knew the questions that were coming, and I had observed that the folks across the hall in leadership development seemed to be having a lot of fun. They were traveling all over, and they were conducting leadership training workshops, and they were coming back with all kinds of great stories about the workshops, about the people they met, of course, about travel stories. And I said, you know, I think I'd like to try that, Larry. Do you think I could observe a class? So he said to me, Glenn, that's funny because next week I'm going out to do 2 workshops in a week. They're 2-day workshops. And he said, you can come along with me on this trip. He said, but there's one thing. He said, I can't really justify your travel expenses unless you teach something. So, you know, my lips start to quiver. What? Larry, what would I teach? I don't know anything. What do you mean? So he said, Glenn, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. And he did. And I went with him, and he gave me 2 hours to teach on the afternoon of the second day, which meant it was pretty hard to screw it up because the group had already formed, and everything was going well. Everybody was in a good mood, and I came in and did my 2 hours, and it went well. And I said, "Oh, oh, I like this. This I like. This I can do." And the lesson there was, Nigel, was that he could have easily said this, and I can imagine some people, some managers doing this. Why don't you teach the 2-day class in one of the stops, and I'll sit in the back of the room, and then I'll give you feedback. No, no, no. He didn't do that. He gave me something. This is what we call positioning the person for success. He positioned me for success. He put me on the program at a time where it was very possible for me to be successful. And I did. And I walked away thinking I could do this. So positioning somebody for success, and I walked away thinking, and I didn't, by the way, realize what Larry had done. I just walked away awfully happy because I changed the trajectory of my life and my career. That's what I started to do after that, was leadership development and training. And I started working with groups and people and traveling and having a great time and developing. And so and by the way, Larry was, no one would confuse him with a great, charismatic, wonderful leader. He just had a lot of good common sense. And he said, this is what this Glenn needs at this time. And that, to me, I now would call him a positive influence leader because that's what he was on me. He, Nigel, saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. I wasn't sure. I didn't think I could actually do that. And he said to himself, Glenn can do this. And I did.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And it's interesting because I think we all need those in our careers, and constantly in our careers. It feels like you need people who. You could have failed at that. You could have screwed it up, can you? You could have quite easily messed it up. We put you in a position where you could do it, but he was willing to let you fail, and be there to pick you up. That's what it sounded like to me. If it had gone wrong, he was there.
That's true
The
too.
impact, yeah. If it went wrong, it wasn't so significant. The people who were being taught would have got a majority of the benefit of that training course. Might have been marked. He took a risk himself, didn't he? Because he might have got marked. They might have marked him down, and get the feedback on your courses and those sort of things. But so he's taken a risk. But he's willing to take a risk, but willing to let you take a risk and fail. But based on that confidence in you.
Yeah, but also he wouldn't have just sat there and let me fall on my face. I know him well enough to say he would have gotten up and said, "Well, let me clarify what Glenn has just said."
Yeah.
And he would have got it back. If the wheels had come off, he would have got it back on track by doing some kind of an intervention. And so yeah, he was there all along. So that was, and he was also very supportive of me, saying, "Glenn, look, you got this. You can do this.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. You wouldn't be here if I didn't think you could do it." That's positive influence.
And
that's being.
It really makes me think of a session that I did many years ago, when I was presenting as part of. I worked for Barclays, and we were presenting at a user group for Oracle, and we were a customer, and it was myself and my manager at the time, Steve Bradshaw. He's a great guy, great manager, and he was doing part of the presentation, I was doing another part of it, and we drilled it, and he worked there and he encouraged me. And this is it was the room for the 70 people, something like that. So like the biggest room I stood in front of. I was trying to think how old I would have been then, mid 20s maybe. But I've done meeting room presentations, and that's probably as much as I've done ever. And it was in a fancy offices in Edinburgh. We'd flown up there and all that. It was all this kind of big thing. But he was encouraging me all the way through, and I remember standing up there with my face twitching, which I thought it was going up like this. And I'd had my notes, and he sat with me and he drilled me through it. We'd gone through his bit, and then I'd done my bit, and encouraged me and supported me all the way through it. And I'd not had the notes, turned the first page, started talking, finished the thing, hadn't turned a single page. My blanket was there. But I think if that evening before, he could have quite happily sat there and gone, and I don't know whether he, from his point of view, would need lots of practice, but he might have been comfortable doing that. He had more experience than me. He could have left me to sit in the hotel room on my own, just shaking, worrying about it, and then failing the following day in that group. But again, it's that thing that it kind of echoes that experience of mine there, that I'd never thought of it in that way that you're talking about there.
Yeah. This is what they do, and a lot of, sometimes it's practiced, and we hope that, people will learn how to be a positive influence leader, because you had to position people for success, but you have to be supportive of them, be encouraging of them. You also have to teach them certain things that they need in order to be successful. How do you design training? How do you design that 2 hours, Glenn? Well, here's what you do. What are you trying to accomplish? We all go back to basic goals, right? Performance objectives and the like, and list those kind of things, and what are the things you need to do in order to be successful. And then he motivated me because he saw that something in me and gave me that opportunity. The other thing, and this kind of gets to, we've kind of covered the range of types of positive influence leaders, is that he was also a role model for me because I had watched him not only the day and a half down there at the training I'm talking to you about, but I had watched him many times in the past. You know, conduct training or presentations, and I watched what he did and how he carried himself and how he used notes and how he interacted with the audience, and I was picking that up all along. So you need that kind of role model too. And we talk about types of positive influence leaders. There's the supportive type that I mentioned, the teacher who teaches you what you need to know in order to be successful, someone who motivates you, who empowers you, as he just did, and also someone who's a role model. Larry, in some ways, he included he included all four, and many all of us have the capacity to do all four. We just happen to use one more frequently than others, but we all have that capacity, and hopefully the good leaders bring it up when necessary. They say, oh, okay, here's what that person needs, and they do it at that time. So good.
It's interesting.
And good example on your part too.
Yeah, just do you say about those four leaders there? Do you find that the four positive influence kind of styles? Do you find that sometimes it's not just the style of the individual and the emphasis of that individual? Do you find sometimes it's that kind of, it's the combined dynamic of the person who, what you took from Larry? It may have been that the bit that you took from him, and I know he's got all of them, but there would have been bits you'd have taken from him that wouldn't necessarily have taken from someone else because you'd have a different connection with that person, but you might have taken maybe the supportive role from someone else rather than the role model role from that person because Larry's the one. Do you find that kind of thing, that kind of dynamic changes on the people?
Yes, and what we say is that doesn't matter where you are now, you can grow, you can get better at any one of those. For example, let's say, well, you're typically not, you're more of a technocrat, so you're not that supportive. You're not the person that says, you got this, Nigel, you can do it, pat on the back and encouraging and the like. But you can learn how to do that. You can learn how to do that. And so people will pick from other people because our what we say to people is that here's where you are now. If you fill out the assessment, you fill out the where you are. It shows your strengths in all four of these styles. But we say here's where you are now, but you can bring up this. You can increase in some of those areas by watching other people, by practice, by just people grow also by recognition. Someone said you would be more effective if you did this. It would be more powerful if it was self-directed, and that's why when we go through this little exercise where people fill out the instrument and they get a score, and then we put them through a half a dozen questions where they eventually get to, going forward, I'm going to do more of this and less of that in order to be more effective. And by the way, leadership, as has been said many times in the past, is situational. So the best leaders are situational. They're the ones that look around and say, okay, this is what's needed right now, and they do it. They're not always giving you the rah-rah speech because that's their go-to position, and that's what they do best. They're giving you what you need at that moment, and that what works best when you are situational.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think that influence and it's a model I'm sure you're aware of, the DIS model that I got introduced many years ago, and
Similar.
Sitting in with that, and it's kind of different focus, obviously, but that whole thing of being aware of your strengths and weaknesses, and being aware that you've got all 4 tools in the kit bag, and you will use all 4 tools subconsciously, but that's that conscious. And in sometimes, if you're in that situational thing, you will. And I suppose it comes to the time of crisis, which will be quite an interesting conversation on that. Is that you will lean towards one when under pressure, and sometimes in those situational situations, if you know, when you get a situation that is where there is a need to change, you may be under pressure, and therefore it's harder to spot the fact that actually in this situation I need to think about how I'm doing this rather than go to my go-to tool. My hammer isn't always going to be the right tool.
Right. You're always not. You can't always find a nail.
No, and that's it. The thing is that whole thing. If the only tool you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, doesn't it? So
that's my point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting that, because kind of taking that then to that crisis, that stress levels, and you talked about positive influence in a time of crisis, and we had this conversation before. I was guessing, and I was assuming that the COVID pandemic was one of the things that triggered you writing that. I'm guessing I'm wrong from what you said earlier. So what was it that triggered you to write that book?
Well, no, you're right. What happened is the first book, that most of which we've been talking about so far, was set to be released in May of 2020, and COVID hit February, March, and boom. And so nobody was interested in reading a leadership book at that time. And so we put it off for a number of months. But we had already thought about wanting to do a second book, because we really felt this idea of positive influence, had some resonance in other areas. And so we started to think about, well, what can we focus on? And my son, my co-author, said, Glenn, it's staring us right in the face. Let's see if what we think about leadership applies when there's a real major crisis.
Yeah.
And that's what got us to look at this. And I said, Jesus, yeah, you're right. So so we set about doing that, and we set about then looking to interview people who probably would be most impacted by the crisis in certain jobs in certain industries. So we went after and got 2 CEOs of healthcare systems. We did the same with hospitality, meaning restaurants and hotels and lodging. We went to transportation. We interviewed the chief administrative office of Amtrak, our train system here. We real estate, which you saw all the empty buildings in downtown office buildings and the like. So we and malls and shopping centers. We interviewed CEOs of 2 real estate companies, and on and on and on. And so we asked them. We said, what are your biggest challenges, and how did you handle those challenges? And they were quite open about it. I think a lot of them were ready to talk by the time we got to them. But so that's how we got to this book on crisis, and it's a powerful experience for us to hear these stories. I mean, it really was just extraordinary.
Yeah, it is interesting about applying stuff in normal run-of-the-mill situations. I know that I saw that sometimes with I was fortunate to do I was on the panel for the PMI UK chapter's annual awards, and there was some of the ones that I was, it's public sector one I was looking at, and there was some of the stories and what people have been doing in that arena, and it's fascinating to see how the positive that can come out. I know it sounds ridiculous about how that teaming, how organisations and how groups can get together in that time of crisis to create something positive out of it. One of the stories was around the some of the Nightingale hospitals, the extra hospital facilities that were thrown together with multiple different authorities and government organisations and commercial organisations that normally would have taken goodness knows how many months and years to have put things in place contractually and protect it. They, in a matter of weeks, they came together and did stuff. And I'm guessing in that context, some of the stuff you're talking about, the positive influence in that instance, I'm sure there are people within there, you'll be able to see some amazing team working sort of examples within there. Putting the badge at the door properly, not with that even subtleness. And
Right.
I suppose I always look at the thing from my audience out there, the project managers. I'm a project manager, and it's both a blessing and a curse when you have a project which becomes the most important project, because it's either in a state and someone gives you a golden ticket, or it's the organisation's most important thing to do, and you've got a golden ticket. So you've got that golden ticket that you can go and say, well, it's this project, and everyone goes, all right, fine, we'll trash everything, we'll give you the resources, but then you've got to deliver it as well, and in crisis mode, you've got teams that you're putting under pressure, you've got individuals that are being reprioritised and causing problems. So it's the dynamic though is really wild, I think. And I suppose what would you say with the traits of successful organisations and successful positive influence in those environments, and how you would contrast it to a normal delivery of things and management of organisations?
Well, a lot of things, leaders learned a lot during this time. They learned a lot about themselves. They learned a lot about how to be more effective leaders. And they also learned a lot about their people during this time, because there's a heightened awareness because of the crisis. Well, they also sort of relearned some things that they had been taught but hadn't used, for example. So, and yes, you're right about some extraordinary teamwork that happened. We had a similar thing in New York City. There's a large convention center called the Javits Convention Center, which houses these, major trade shows and conventions. Yeah. And they turned it into a 2,500 bed field hospital in about 2 weeks. The employees there, the craft employees at the Javits Center, and the Army Corps of Engineers, who knows how to do this stuff. Yeah. They do it everywhere. They came in and collaborated and did it. There was tremendous collaboration that doesn't get talked about a lot in developing the vaccines. I mean, 9 months for a pharmaceutical company to come up with a vaccine is extraordinary. And the public-private cooperation, because the government provided the money and these pharmaceutical companies put everything aside in order to do this. And the degree of efficacy of these vaccines is extraordinary. They work, and it's never been done before. So that kind of cooperation, examples of there was what happened with a lot of the leaders is they started to more concern and caring about the employees. How were they doing? And where possible, they got out of their office and they started walking the floors if they could. In a hospital, they were walking the floors of the hospital, the CEOs, saying to the employees, saying to the nurses and doctors, how are you doing?
Yeah.
What do you need? How can I help? And they did. I mean, they told them we need more ventilators or N95 masks or some, that sort. And it was the really effective leaders said, well, I'll get it for you, or I got to tell you, supply chain is killing us. We probably won't be able to get it for a while, but here's what we're doing in the interim. So they were out there talking to people, saying, look, if you need something, if you need to take some time off because of the stress, you can imagine working in a hospital during that kind of period. I mean, it was extraordinary. I've talked to people who did it. And so do you need to talk to a counselor? We're making psychologists on staff available, ministers and other religious leaders available also as counselors. When they couldn't do that, and by the way, the Amtrak people were walking the floors, walking the corridors of the stations. They were riding the trains. Same thing, asking, what can we do? How can we help? And trying to simplify things for them. Of course, we hear about all these incidents on airplanes where people wouldn't wear a mask and were being very disruptive and the like. Well, trains had the same had the same prohibition. You had to wear a mask. But what they said to onboard employees, we're more concerned about you. So do not confront, don't get into a fight with any passenger who doesn't want to wear a mask. Just say to the other passenger or the passenger next to them or any other passenger in that car, if you're not comfortable here, you can change your seat and move to another car or another seat where you're more comfortable, and not engage with that person, because that's not their job to get into a physical fight with somebody on the train. In other instances, I talked to a gentleman who's the CEO of a company that owns 21 owns and operates 21 restaurants. He obviously couldn't walk the floors of 21 restaurants, but he had regular phone calls with the 21 general managers, and he asked them, how's it going? What are you doing? And they talked about how they were adapting to the situation. Sometimes it was they reduced the menu, they changed the menu because, again, they had supply chain issues too.
Yeah.
Couldn't get a lot of things. They can't get employees to work, so they adjusted their shifts. So on the call, Nigel, they're sharing all this information with each other. And so one general manager would say, this is what's worked for us. And the other one would say, I haven't tried that. I'm going to try that. And so what he said to us, the CEO, he said, prior to this, those 21 restaurants were in competition with each other. Everybody wanted to be the number one restaurant by all their measures, revenue, customer satisfaction, and the like. Now they became cooperative and collaborative. And he said, we're not going back. Going forward, we're going to still operate that way because it worked.
Yeah.
And more of that sort of thing where there was more collaboration, more caring, and this would surprise a lot of people, more empowerment. Because what people found is that employees were making decisions on their own because there was no management and supervision around. They were dealing with a customer, with a patient, with a client. They had to make decisions on the spot about how to handle this situation, and they did. And you know what? The leaders discovered, we got some pretty smart people out there.
Yeah.
And we haven't been using them. We got some very smart people that have been underutilized.
Yeah.
And we got to, this empowerment thing, which we've read about in some books, it actually works.
It's funny with that. That triggers a thought of mine of the Southwest Airlines and Tom Kelleher. Is it Tom Kelleher? I think it is. And that kind of devolution, and I'm not sure if that carried on, but it kind of to the employees to make a decision with the priority of the customer, and that customer's journey was the priority, not the businesses making the money on the ticket,
Yes.
which made them successful. And that's this, you're talking about the same thing there, aren't you? If you've got someone in a restaurant, this person's not happy with what they've had, although there's nothing wrong from what you, and the person's, you can make the decision to go, well, okay, I'll get you something else, that's fine, throw it in the bin, they are good. There might be an awkward customer, but you've created a positive experience for them in that restaurant, and if you've made that decision, whereas otherwise I need to go and get my manager, the manager comes in, the manager does it anyway, I had to call the manager over, is the message that's left to that person when they go, whereas the other one is the person, oh yeah, they were really good, they were really helpful, they just looked after me, and that empowerment, as you say, people talk about it, but it doesn't always translate into actions, does it? And giving people those boundaries and those borders within organisations.
Yeah, and so that happened. What was needed was more communication during this time, because there was so much being thrown at us. So the really good managers, the really good effective leaders, communicated sometimes with limited information, because the ones who didn't communicate were the ones that would not put out a directive, would not put out a communication unless they had complete information.
Yeah.
And as a result, when you do that sort of thing, what do? You leave the employees to try to figure it out for themselves, and they're being bombarded with information by a whole bunch of different people. They're listening, they're reading social media, they're listening to the television, and they're hearing all kinds of, well, maybe the vaccine's bad for you, or maybe you shouldn't do this, or we should do that. And one of the people that we interviewed said, one of the things we had to get used to, this is one of the leaders that we interviewed, he said we had to get used to operating with incomplete information. We had to get comfortable with saying to our employees, look, based on the information that we have right now, this is what we've decided to do. But stay tuned, because tomorrow it may change when we get additional information. So it was a big change for us to make decisions and put out and communicate with employees based on what we knew was fragments of information, because you're getting information from your industry sources, from your government sources at all levels, from the health authorities putting out information. So it's coming at you, just you being bombarded with information, and you're not sure which one is accurate. You're not sure if you understand it. Some of the stuff comes out in highly arcane medical terms and technical jargon that a lot of people just don't quite understand. So that was an issue also. So getting comfortable with communicating with information, and not, by the way, sugarcoating, covering up, denying, trying to deceive people, being as honest as you can and saying, this is what we know now, and this is what we're going to decided to do, and things may change in the future, but we will let you know when it does. So people understood, the employees understood that the leaders cared about them. They were concerned about their health and safety, because they realized people were worried about coming to work and getting sick. That was a concern of people, and they wanted to make sure that they understood that we care about you, and so being authentic about that, being honest with the communication, for example, really elevated their credibility as leaders. I want to talk about some of the things that the leaders learned, because it's some powerful stuff, Nigel. And I want to share with you some of the quotes that people shared with us based on their experience. Because we asked them, what did you learn about yourself as a leader, and what did you learn about people in your organization? Well, one of the things that they said they learned was, I don't have to always be the smartest person in the room. And you know the
Yeah.
old expression, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, and all, as one of them said to us, or that I had to be always the first person to pop up with the answer to a problem. That we had some pretty smart people, and we needed to, let them go and let them do some problem solving and communication. Um, so that was one of the critical things that came out of it. But they also learned that crisis leadership is stressful. It was a very
Yeah.
stressful time for leaders, and it impacted them in a very, very dramatic way. And um, I just want to share with you some of these, and your listeners, some of these things that people said to us. This is somebody in the hospitality industry said, Glenn, I took things too personally. It got to me. I had a heart attack. I learned from that
Jeez.
experience that I need to go more with the flow and empower my staff. And by the way, I've been in touch with a number of these leaders, including him, and he's doing fine. Another leader said, I tend to internalize a lot of stress in trying to be there for everybody. I felt that people in the organization expected me always to be there, creating stress.
Yeah.
Another one in health, this is one of the CEOs in healthcare. I had to be positive in the face of the virus. I had to and did overcome my personal fear of getting sick and yet go to work every day. I even surprised myself. So there was all this stress on the leaders, not only stress on the employees, but stress on the leaders. And it was a very difficult time. But they learned, as I said earlier, about empowerment, that their own people, many of them will surprise you. And that's a nice surprise to have. And I got some pretty smart people here, and I need to let them go. Now, some people will also disappoint you. It's not a perfect world. Some people will disappoint you. They will quit. They will. They just can't take it. They they go. They leave. Um, and that's important to know, because in the end you want to know who you can depend upon. Because by the way,
Yeah.
crises keep coming, and we don't know what the next one will be. We hope it's not as um, awful as COVID-19 was, but there will be other crises, because there's been crises in organizations for years. Um, so getting ready for that is a critical thing that many of the leaders learned, that they needed to be much better prepared going forward.
It's interesting because, as you said, there's nothing. We've not certainly. There will be certain parts of the world that have dealt with it, but we've not dealt with anything as intense as this since back in the 40s and 30s. That was so
Right.
wide-ranging and so intense. But as you say, there's always a crisis, and it's all relevant, isn't it? It's relative, sorry, to there may be a crisis in your team, there may be a crisis in your department, there might be a crisis in your branch, there might be a crisis in the company, and there's lots of companies now with slowdown that there are crises where the organisations are disappearing because there are crises, and there's others that are going through these crises and getting through them, and it's kind of that it kind of makes me think about it, is that the difficulties we went through COVID and the some of the positives that not positives, some of the muscles that you had to learn to stretch and learn to use, and the tools and techniques that we dealt with. And as you say, a lot of that's come out that we are now still able to access those, but there'll be a time that'll wane, and our effectiveness on it. I think the mental health thing that you mentioned about is certainly since that, the awareness, the thought of it, the impact of neurodiversity, the impact of mental health as a and I joined them two together because I see them two as being two they're not joined together, they seem to have risen together in awareness from my perspective. But certainly the talking about mental health is something that before COVID I would have and I had some struggles along myself, but I know that talking about people's mental health in the context that we do now, as it being a major part of an organisation's well-being to help people with their physical and their mental health, and that being part of the corporate agenda, wasn't there in 2019. It wasn't as focused, realising, as you said, that care for people to go, well, if we haven't got these people, we haven't got a business. If we haven't got these people, we haven't got an organisation of any sort, because they're the lifeblood of that organisation. And I think there are some. It feels like some of the lessons are embedded now, or becoming embedded in society. But I think there's probably still some things that will wane. I can't see those disappearing, but things like having good empathy for your staff, thinking about them first. It's hard to do when you're under pressure to deliver. And I'll admit myself, I've been there in situations where I need to talk to someone, I need to chat, and I need to deal with them on that. Right, I'll do that later. Right, oh, this is on my desk now, I've got to get this done. Oh, I'll go and see that. Oh no, if this is coming. And I've got to the point where I've missed. I knew the individual was struggling. I knew they needed my support.
Right.
And they went off ill. And I beat myself up on that because I wasn't there ready. I knew it. I was trying to get there. I didn't get there because other things got in the way. And I think nowadays, I'm better at spotting when I'm delaying those things just because I'll sort it later, because that important and urgent thing, and the people are the important, and the work is not is the urgent sometimes. Whereas if you focus on the people, those urgent things reduce because they get sorted.
Yeah, I think the mental health issues did get elevated during this time because it was very stressful. I mean, and you couldn't miss it, and so it did get elevated. My concern, because I think one of the last questions we asked the leaders, did you conduct an after-action review when this all, and you went back to work and the like? Did you conduct an after-action? And people said, mostly what people said, oh, we did it sort of informally, which made me question whether anything was done. And I think that was a big miss, because everybody was so anxious to go back to the way they were working, bring big people back into the office, start up, get the restaurants working again, and the like, that they didn't really take the time to do it. And this is something that we've been pushing. In fact, I just finally just put out an article. I just posted it on LinkedIn.
I noticed that a couple of days ago.
Yeah, on how to do an after-action review, asking people, did their organization do it? And then in the article, and it's not that, it's a very short article because it doesn't take that much. It's not that much to it. You can have there's a lot to it in the outcomes that you can get if you do it, but just teaching people what are the right questions to ask and how do you go about doing and so forth. And I hope people look at that article, and it's still not too late to do it, to set aside a couple of hours with the leadership team and maybe with a representative from the the workforce to come in and talk about what did we learn, what did we do well, what didn't we do well, what did we miss, what should we do differently next time.
Yeah.
And you can learn a heck of a lot from that. As you know, as a project manager, Nigel, you do it at the end of a project, or at least good project managers do it at the end of a project, and they say, all right, how did it go? Right?
I think that lessons learned thing is something I see in projects is something we should be looking at all the way along. Some of the sort of more agile methodologies where you're more you're reflective on a regular basis rather than at the end, because the danger you have at the end of a project, if you've got a 9-month project, a 12-month project, the people at the end of the project aren't the people who were at the beginning of the project. So the fact that it's a bag of spanners at the end, maybe things that we could have done at the beginning that no one was around trying to fix. So I think there's benefit, and you need to do it all the way along. I think what I see from organisations, and I think what I'm seeing is that there are probably lessons learned that people learn and are taking forward, but aren't consciously doing that review that you're talking about and going, hang on a minute, where's our new kit bag of tools ready to have them and have that be able to go, right, we've got this issue, what's the playbook for that? Because I think there's probably some playbook that could detail out their playbooks and then go, right, okay, that didn't work, change that, we've got that ready, keep it. It's like your disaster recovery, your business continuity pack, and essentially every organisation had a business continuity plan, which I think was probably suboptimal for what we went through, which means that business continuity plan needs to be uplifted a bit, whether that be from business practice, whether it be from communication, using daily rituals and those sort of things, and that changing those, and some of those will fit into what we've got down, because the hybrid working driven some of that good quality rituals now is kind of embedded in organisations a little bit. But I think I understand that it's kind of that lessons learned, that retrospective is something every organisation should be doing. And I don't, for my organisation, I don't know whether people are doing it all the way up here. But the bigger the organisation is, the more of them that should be done at different bases, because different parts of the organisation would have held it in different. But it's an investment, I suppose, and I suppose everyone was keen to get back to normality.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm just looking at the time, and we're just nearly coming up on the hour. It's been a fascinating conversation, as I knew it would be, and I suppose just cover off the last few minutes. What if you were going to talk to someone about either being better, becoming a better positive influence for their teams? What would you say to do first? What's the first thing that you say? Go tomorrow morning. This is what I would do if I was you.
Can I say go buy the book, or?
Of course you can. That's it. Aside from go buy the book.
But let me tell you,
go buy the book. There'll be links in. There'll be a link in the show notes, everyone. So jump on a copy.
There's a serious part to saying that, because the book was built for people to use it as a guide for learning. Because at the end of every chapter, there are 4 questions that get you to reflect on what you just read. For example, if there's a chapter in the book on leadership in a crisis about the major challenges that leaders faced. And at the end, one of the questions, at the review questions, is what challenges did you face in your organization, in your industry, and how did you cope with them? Well, that's that question can produce a heck of a lot of learning. And so so that's why I say, the book is a great place to start. Both books if you want to talk about the first book, which is How to Be a Positive Influence Leader, that's the questions are there too, and there's also the self-assessment that I mentioned at the back of that book, and the publisher has been kind enough to publish it as a separate booklet so that it makes it a lot easier than doing it in the book. In the book on leadership in a crisis, at the end of that book, there's a organizational assessment on what were the major crises that we faced and how well did we address them. And so that's a good way of doing it, in the sense of, okay, we can learn from our own experience, because I always think experience-based learning is the most powerful and has the most lasting impact. And so that's why I suggest it, and that's why, going back to the start of our conversation, I always write for practitioners, because this is what practitioners do. They get through with a project and they say, what did we learn? How do we do? What do we do different next time? And so we doing the same kind of thing here, making experience the basis for learning. So I that's what I've been doing my whole life, is experience-based learning.
Yeah, that's super powerful.
That's where I would go.
Cool, brilliant. Thank you for that. So, if people want to find out more, what's the best way, or get in touch with you? What's the best way to connect? What's the best way to find out more about the books or about you in general?
Well, there's the website. The website is thepositiveinfluenceleader.com, and there you'll find information. We've written a bunch of articles since the publication of the book, of both books. And there's more that haven't been posted yet. And also there are interviews and talks that we've given, podcasts that we've done that are also on this website.
All right, cool.
Plus we have a blog called Stories of Positive Influence, where people sent in, and I certainly encourage your listeners to do the same, their personal story of positive influence, meaning someone who helped them by being a positive influence on them. So they can go and see what I mean, and we're talking 200-300 words. We're not talking about even an article length, but a very concise description of, I worked, my first manager was Nigel, and he did the following things, and it had a great impact on me for the following reason. And then we make a little comment about this little story as to how it fits into the overall idea of being a positive influence leader. I encourage you to do that. So you can contact me. You can send in your story of positive influence to me, Glenn, Glenn, at thepositiveinfluenceleader.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, pretty active on LinkedIn, post a lot of things there, and you can certainly contact me. I encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a message. I do read, and I do follow up, and I do respond, and I encourage you to get in touch with us that way as well. Brilliant.
Well, Glenn, thank you very much for giving me so much time and being a positive influence on me. And hopefully it's been a positive influence to all of my listeners. And have a brilliant rest of your day.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it, Nigel.
Brilliant. Thanks, Glenn. Bye.